we have a shell game with the ICBMs. We'll have a field somewhere out in Montana or Idaho or whatever. We'll have a whole lot of silos around a little circle. We will have an underground railroad train, and this train will run around on a random schedule and put the missile in a different silo. And therefore, there's no way the Russians can get that. They'd have to take out all the silos with extreme accuracy. So that sounds like a good project for ESP man. So we did study. I decided to do a study on that. What is the vulnerability of that system to remote viewing detection techniques? Well, it turned out that there was a simulation that was being done by one of our consultants. It was just sort of like a video ESP game, where on the screen were 10 circles to represent 10 possible targets. They were chosen by a random number generator. And then the individual, of course none of them were lit up, had to push a key on the keyboard to say which number target she thought was the target. And it turned out that with 10 circles, you'd expect 1 in 10. In fact, her hit rate was 1 in 4. And we were using a very sophisticated statistical procedure. We did many trials to find it. And to make a long story short, she did 500 trials, and from that 500 trials, she got 12 out of 12 right. No misses. The probability of doing this result by chance is 1 in a trillion. So, of course, we were very excited about that. We briefed our Air Force contract monitor. He said, well, you know, there's a group down in Norton Air Force Base whose job it is to try to figure out whether the Russians can come up with ways to defeat this shell game situation. You should go down and brief them. So we did. They were doing all kinds of neat things like telemetering cockroaches, because the cockroaches would go to the missile, the silo that had the missile in it, and all that kind of thing. Anyway, they thought this was great, and they started briefing it up the chain. This was not happy news for the hierarchy in the Air Force, because the Navy was coming on strong with its nuclear missiles. SAC bombers were kind of getting passé. They didn't like to hear this. So they put a lot of red tape around it, a lot of classification, and disbanded the group at Norton Air Force Base. That's the way it goes. Another thing that occurred during the Carter administration, if you recall, was the Iranian hostage situation. There are many times during that whatever 100 numbers of days where Ayatollah Khomeini would say, I'm going to release a hostage. So the White House would get all excited. They'd send people out, send a medical team over to Frankfurt ready to, examine the hostage and so on, and nothing would happen. Cry wolf, cry wolf, cry wolf. Well, this had happened so many times that whenever you would say that, nobody paid any attention. By that time, we were working directly for a fellow in the National Security Council. And he heard that Khomeini had said he's going to release another hostage. So he decided just to check it out. And so he had us target on an individual to get a physical, medical, and psychological profile. This is something we did all the time, usually a head of state or whatever. We never knew who the target person was. I mean, I know it sounds crazy, because it is crazy, I guess. He would say, I've got a name written on an envelope in my breast pocket here in Washington, D.C. I just want you to tell me about that person. I have to admit that even after 13 years of doing this, every time I launched into an experiment, I'd say to myself, what am I doing here? This can't possibly work. In this case, he gave a physical description that mentioned, our remote viewer gave a physical description that mentioned, that matched the person that Khomeini said he was going to release. He gave a psychological profile that was also accurate. And he gave a medical condition and said, this fellow is so sick, he should be in a hospital. And yet in a few days I see him on a plane. And the vertigo alone practically kills him. So anyway, we turned that data over to our National Security Council guy, and he said, well, this thing about being on a plane, maybe he is going to be released. So for the first time in a long time, they did send a medical team one more time to Frankfurt. And in fact, the hostage was released. He had multiple sclerosis, and the stress of being a hostage was really doing him in. Khomeini did not want a dead hostage on his hands. Eventually, the national security guy went and sat down with ex-hostage and said, I have a source here, meaning our remote viewer, that I can't reveal, but I always like to calibrate my sources. Let me just read what he said. And as he started reading the transcript, he could see that ex-hostage Queen was getting more and more irate. And finally, Queen jumped up out of his chair and said, the only way you could have had that data was if my guard was your source, and if that was the case, why didn't you get me out of there sooner? Pat Price, the one who did the crane, the one who did the swimming pool complex, he was good enough that the CIA just finally hired him outright, and he went to work for them, targeted on some foreign embassies, successfully described the interiors and location of code rooms. The operations officer concluded, it's my considered opinion that this technique, whatever it is, offers definite operational possibilities. Well, what do some other people say about the program? I mean, I've been bragging about it, but what do other people say? Well, at least the CIA admitted they had such a program. Here's one we were told would never see the light of day because it was controlled by the Air Force and they did not want people to know how good remote viewing was at this time. But after President Carter got out of office, he was giving a speech to students in a Georgia university, and some students said, well, what was one of the more unusual things that you experienced as president? He said, well, one time there was a plane that went down in Zaire, and we wanted to find it. It was a Soviet electronics plane, and spy satellites couldn't locate the wreckage because it was down under the jungle canopy. And so my CIA director, Stansfield Turner, turned to remote viewers, actually two, and we found where it was, and we went in and we got it. And that was true. Meanwhile, Major Thompson, Army Chief of Staff for Intelligence, was briefed by us, and he decided to set up a program within the Army Intelligence Group at Army INSCOM. Finally, in this history that got declassified in 1995, they finally admitted that the DoD paranormal psychology program had done more than 200 tasks, operational military organizations, applying remote viewing to obtain information available from other sources. As the program began to get declassified, this began to come out. Give an example of what came out of this group. My fourth row attendee here, Joe McMonigal, his wife Scooter. There are dozens. In fact, you should see his books to see descriptions of many of them. But in one case, which is particularly striking, he was given the coordinates of a location. There was sort of a big building on the land somewhere. And he described that they were building a submarine. Not only was it a submarine, it was the largest submarine there could possibly be. And not only that, but it was full of slots for missiles to come out of. And at the time, I guess I won't name names, people said this is nonsense, can't possibly be. Besides, this is on the land.